Buenas tardes. Hoy tenemos el gusto de poder tener algunas palabras del doctor Elliot Turiel. Quiero primeramente mencionar un poco de quién es Elliot Turiel y la relevancia que puede tener su trabajo para la comunidad de habla hispana. Elliot Turiel es doctor en psicología por la Universidad de Yale y estudió con Lawrence Kohlberg. Turiel ha desarrollado diversas líneas de investigación, entre las que podemos decir está el desarrollo humano, el desarrollo moral, la ética y las desigualdades sociales. Elliot Turiel ha enseñado en diversas universidades, entre ellas está Harvard, Columbia, y actualmente él está en Berkeley, la Universidad de California. También fue distinguido como Jerome Hutto Professor of Education y es Dean asociado de asuntos académicos. También fue becario Guggenheim y ha publicado diversos artículos, libros que abordan estas temáticas. Quiero únicamente mencionar dos de ellos que podrían tener efecto en nuestra comunidad de habla hispana. Es autor del Desarrollo del Conocimiento Social, la Moral y el Convenio, y es editor de Desarrollo y Cambio Cultural, Procesos Recíprocos. Estamos con el doctor Elliot Turiel y vamos a saber más de su trabajo, y especialmente en dos elementos fundamentales para nuestro momento, que es el del desarrollo moral y el desarrollo que él ha venido trabajando, desarrollo moral en niños y en jóvenes. Particularmente le vamos a pedir al doctor Elliot Turiel que nos hable del desarrollo moral en jóvenes en condiciones y contextos culturales diversos, muy pertinentes para nuestro tiempo, en un contexto de diversidad. Elliot, thank you very much to accept this interview here in the National Politécnico Institute. It's in the north of the city. And first, I want really to know more about your theories, ideas on moral development. It's a topic that is very relevant in this moment in Mexico, especially for young people. Mm-hmm. So first, please, can you tell us more about how the social and moral development happens, or is constructed in a young people in ages going through 15 to 17 years old? That is our main concern in this moment. So can you tell us a bit more?
Yes, it's a very difficult question you're posing, the one of how thinking is constructed. And before we get to the 15, 17-year-olds, it's important to say that the construction begins much earlier, at very young ages, 3, 4, 5 years of age. And then we have to ask, what is construction? And to think about that question, we have to understand, I believe, that people think and reason, several philosophers like Martha Nussbaum and Sen have discussed this and have pointed to how human beings make choices, reason, and have certain capabilities. Now they haven't been concerned with development or construction, but I think the person who had the most and the best to say about that was Piaget, of course. And he too worked on the assumption that much of the way people operate, function, is through thought and reasoning, and that their reasoning is systematic. And if we do think and reason, then it makes sense that development is not an accommodation to the environment. It's not biologically determined, but that it is constructed. And what constructed means for young children is that they're thinking about their experiences. They're thinking about what's going on in the world around them in their lives and trying to make sense of what they're experiencing. So they have the capabilities to put things together in their minds. And that's what construction is. And as they are doing that, they're able to perceive and recognize that some of the ways they think solve problems in the world, and some of the ways they think do not solve problems, but are inadequate to solving problems. So that presents a conflict for them at whatever age. And it's in dealing with those kinds of conflicts and recognition that that there are inadequacies in the way they're thinking, that they then try to generate new ideas to solve these problems in a better way. And that's what construction means. You asked specifically about moral and social development, and it's that kind of process, but with regard to morality, it's thinking about social relationships, social interactions, also thinking about rules and laws. But for young children, I think it's mainly thinking about their experiences with other people, and that is other children, children who are older than they are and younger, and adults as well. And it's all the experiences that people have, and this is, I think, where universality comes in, anywhere in the world, around people trying to get along with each other, people harming each other, or people, including children, trying to do things that benefit others as well as the self, sharing and helping. And it's thinking about all those kinds and then reflecting on those kinds of experiences that they form and construct these kinds of judgments. And as I say, that happens very early in age, by 3, 4, 5, 6 years of age. So the foundations are there for what's going to go on in the age range you asked about, 15 to 17-year-olds. But I think it's the same kind of process with the older people, what we call adolescents, 15 to 17-year-olds, where but their social relationships get more complicated, and they're thinking about broader aspects of the environment, about politics, maybe, some of them, about more complicated social relationships. They're probably thinking about school as an institution. And it's, again, the same sort of process of trying to make sense of all these experiences. And they're also thinking about their future and what they're going to do, and their careers, and sexuality, of course, and many other things that they're exposed to, which sometimes gets them into trouble and problems.
Okay. Elliot, in your paper, Moral Reasoning, that now translated into Spanish, and so in that, at the end of your paper, there is a very interesting and open conclusion, not a closed conclusion, but this is more related, that conclusion, with the dialogue between local and regional conditions affecting the moral development, and then, but also the dialogue also is with the universalism that you said in the paper. So that paper has been consulted, read by our community, in Spanish. So, but it's possible to say how it happened, this dialogue between the local and the universal, let's say, conditions of a construction of this moral development and social development?
Well, with regard to the universal, it's what I've just been talking about, which is that the construction through the kinds of experiences that I mentioned will occur everywhere. It's not dependent on a particular culture or a particular set of local arrangements. And people everywhere, I believe, form judgments about morality, about harm and welfare, about fairness and justice, about people's rights. And I do not believe that the concept of rights is a Western construction. I think it exists all over the world, including in non-Western cultures. So that's so the framework that people come to, what you're referring to as the local, are these general and common judgments about morality. But then in their particular places, their culture, the practices that exist in their culture can differ from one place to another. And so, for example, and this is one of the things I discuss in the paper you're referring to, in some cultures which can be referred to as patriarchal, there is a strong hierarchical distinction made between males and females, with males in control much of the time, with rules and norms that give certain prerogatives to act in certain ways to males that females are not supposed to do. And more generally, in the family especially, men are in control. There are many practices that favor males over females, like in some places polygamy. Even with arranged marriages, in some cultures, males have much more choice than females do in the arrangements. So these are, and then in some places, like in North America, it is not that there's strict equality between males and females, but there may be more equality, less strict demarcations, more opportunities given to women than in other cultures. So I think that there's a real combination or intersection of these general moral judgments that people make and how they think about the particulars of their social system. Again, this kind of hierarchy that we're talking about. And you see these hierarchies in other ways. It's not just males and females. It's social castes. It's social classes. It's seen in majority and minority ethnic or racial groups. And in some accounts of the way culture influences the way people think, it's thought that these are fixed. These kinds of arrangements are fixed within the culture, and people, whether they be males who are in dominant positions and females who are not, just accept it as the way it should be and that they value it. And we've done research to look at that, and our research shows that that really should be questioned, because what we've tried to do is approach this from the perspective of not only the people who are in authority and in positions of power and control, but also from the perspective of people who are lower in the social hierarchy. A lot of cultural research has concentrated on using, and in anthropology these are called informants, on using people who are in positions of power and authority to tell them what the culture is like. And it leaves out a lot of people. But in our research, where we try to carefully look at how different groups are approaching this, we find, for example, that females in patriarchal cultures, on the one hand, want to be part of the culture and accept their roles, but not entirely. Because on the other hand, they apply their moral judgments and recognize that much of this is unfair and are critical of it. And they act in a variety of ways, some of which I think are discussed in that paper, to get around these restrictions that they think are placed on them in an unfair way. So they look for ways to indirectly achieve what they're trying to achieve, or sometimes they use deception to get around it. So I think this is the kind of combination that addresses the question of how we have universality and local arrangements that can differ from one culture or another. But there's another aspect to this that I would want to mention, which is that in comparing cultures, on the one hand, we do have these commonalities, as I say, in the way people make moral judgments. On the other hand, there are these differences or variations in what you're referring to, I think, as local arrangements. Maybe, I don't know if that was your word. But at the same time, it's very difficult and complicated to compare cultures. The usual way is to think that you can compare this culture with that and see that similar or they're different. And then if they're different, then people would try to describe them as different from each other, and a very common description that I think a lot of people are familiar with is that there are individualistic cultures and collectivistic cultures, and they're just different. But from the perspective of the approach that I've been talking about, that gets much more complicated, because if you, and this is a little difficult to explain, so you could help me with it, if you, for example, identify people in one culture, let's call it culture A, who are lower on the social hierarchy, and people in, as well as those who are higher, and then people who are lower in culture B, who are lower in the social hierarchy, and people who are higher, then then the question becomes who resembles who. Okay? Now there are ways in which, as being part of the same culture, people at the higher levels will resemble in perspectives those in the same culture at the lower level. But there are also ways in which their perspectives are very different from each other, because they play different roles. One group is in control, has personal entitlements that the other doesn't, and the other group, as I was saying before, sees this as unfair. So there are differences. And then if you compare those in the lower position in culture A with those in lower positions in culture B, there are many ways in which there are commonalities between them in perspectives that differ from people at higher levels in their own culture. All right? All right? So I think we have to move away from simply saying, well, what are the differences between the cultures, to what are all the different perspectives within a culture, and there are many perspectives. There's diversity within a culture, and then move towards not only looking at differences between cultures, but more complicated commonalities between different cultures for people who are in similar positions.
Okay. Elliot, the last question is, what is the current research of Elliot Turiel? What you are working on now?
Well, I'll mention quickly three projects. Okay? One is a continuation of the work on culture that I've been talking about, and including work on how people think about differences in power and control, and how people in subordinate positions think about that and deal through sometimes through deception or bending rules of honesty to get around control and power. So we're doing, we've done a few studies on that, and we're doing more. Another set of studies that I'm working on have to do with getting a better understanding of changes within the moral domain. And that's complicated. You know, people before, like Piaget and Kohlberg, proposed there are these stages that cover changes in moral judgments pretty well. But from the perspective of domains, which I talk about a little bit in the paper, it's more complicated because of the contextual features of applying moral judgments. And so we're trying to get a better grasp of how, and we've started with 7-year-olds and working through up to 16, 17-year-olds, what changes occur at those ages. But that also has to include how judgments are similar across ages and how they apply those judgments differently in different contexts, which involves coordination. And what we find so far is that the older ones of 14, 15, 16-year-olds are better able to take into account different features of situations and coordinate them than younger children. But yet younger and older have basic judgments about morality. And then there's a new set of projects that we're just getting started on, and it is to get a better understanding, and there's been very little research on this, of how children and adolescents and adults think about equality, the idea of equality, the whole concept of equality, which is a very important moral notion that many philosophers have talked about. But there's very little psychological research on that. And it's a complicated set of concepts to study because there are many situations in which inequalities make sense, even from a moral point of view, but they make sense from a pragmatic perspective. I'll give you a simple example. If you think about an orchestra, right? That's organized so that there's a conductor and some people who are more in the playing of the music. They have different roles, and everybody accepts that. And it's not usually treated as a moral issue. And there are many economic and political structures that require that kind of inequality. But yet inequality in many contexts can be a moral problem. So to have a better understanding of all that, we have to go to basics and do research on just the concepts that are formed about equality and inequality. And as I say, I think there's very little psychological research on that.
Thank you very much, Elliot, to accept the interview and to be
you.
here in Mexico in the National Polytechnic Institute. Thank you very much.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you.